Let's get the show started.
Definitely.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to PEN Prithvi, the fortnightly program, formerly physical, now virtual, where we speak to writers from India and beyond, writing in many, many languages. And we are very, very privileged and honored to welcome uh, one of the founders of PEN Prithvi, the Ranjit Hoskote himself. And the occasion is that he will be discussing and reading from his latest book, his latest poetry collection, which is, of course, Hunchprose, published by Penguin and widely available offline and online in India. So he doesn't really need any introduction. If you're here, you know about his work already, but just to go through the formality, I will read his brief bio. Ranjit Hoskote is a poet, cultural theorist, translator, and curator. His 7 collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, Jonah Whale, published also by ARC in the UK in 2020 as the Atlas of Lost Beliefs, honored with the Poetry Society Summer Recommendation there. And of course, the latest is Hunchprose, Penguin, Hamish Hamilton, 2021. Hoskote's translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman saint's poetry has appeared as I Lalla, the poems of Lal Ded, Penguin Classics 2011. Hoskote curated India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale under the title Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode 2011. He has received the Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award, the Sahitya Akademi Translation Award, and the S.H. Raza Literature Award. His poems have been translated into German, Hindi, Bangla, Irish, Marathi, Swedish, Spanish, and Arabic. In April 2006, and this is the PEN Prithvi Connect right here, Hoskote co-founded PEN Prithvi with Sampurna Chatterjee and Sanjana Kapoor. I should let our audience know, in case you don't know already, that until quite recently, we were broadcasting these Zoom sessions from the studio kindly created by Prithvi for these and other uh, events. But because of the severity of the pandemic, we have decided to not visit the studio for safety's sake. So, in what we hope is an anomalous occurrence, we are both in the comfort of our own homes. So welcome, Ranjit. It is, once again a pleasure to be speaking with you, especially
Thank you.
about this wonderful new book, Hunch Prose. I just finished reading it not quite 2 days back, and it is still lingering with me in a way that your work generally does. But I must say that the feeling tone or the flavor of that lingering is rather different from Jonah Whale. The voices in Jonah Whale, at least in my reading, at least in the way that I absorbed it, the voices in Jonah Whale are louder. They proclaim, they declare, they lament loudly. There is a certain sense of a large stage, sound stage that they are operating in. The voices in Hunch Prose are also important, also significant, but they are quieter and they are more murmurous, more intimate in their decibel level, as if I may put it that way. So this is, I think, this is a change in tonality, I would say. And can you take us through some of the circumstances that molded these poems, the way
Sure.
that, yeah.
Thank you so much, Suhit. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, whether formally or informally. And it's lovely to be at Bennett Prithvi and although we're not at the Prithvi studio right now, as we might well have been, the spirit is the same, that of samvad, of conversation. So, and thank you also for your very sensitive reading of the shift from Jonah Whale to Hunchprose in terms of tonality. You're absolutely right. There is something polyphonic about Jonah Whale. There were voices that came forth in a multitude. The treatment was often more operatic. I worked with, at least in 2 or 3 of the longer larger poems. I worked with the device of the libretto. It was a script for many voices. And what you see in Hunchprose, as you rightly said just now, is a completely different and quieter tone. It's more pensive. The book was written for the most part over 2019 and finished in early 2020. And it really took on this kind of tonality because it marked also a sort of retreat to a place where one could think of how the great urgencies at large could be dealt with whilst preserving a certain interiority. How does one continue with the inner life in turbulent times? How does one, even as one engages with everything that is turbulent and broken, how does one try and think of healing and mending and caring? So these were some of the concerns in Hunchprose. I realize I should now hold this book up.
There you are. What a magnificent cover that is.
That is entirely thanks to Ehlavat Gunjan of Penguin. Absolutely marvelous design intelligence.
So, it is, I wouldn't call it a paradox, but at least it's been a couple of years since I've read Jonah Whale, and just to continue that comparison or that juxtaposition a little, Jonah Whale is an extremely personal interior book, at least in my reading. This one is also an interior book, but it is more outward looking. It is engaging with the ecological crisis, with, as you put it, wonderment at our place in the cosmos also. But it is a quieter tone, which I found quite remarkable. And also, but of course, the poems have some of your distinctive hallmarks that we have come to identify with you, which is unconventional placement on the page. And of course, most of the poems uh, end without punctuation. They end vanishingly in that sense. And they end on they don't end with a
thump.
drum beat, a thump. They fade out, or there is an air of there is not an air of resolution to the endings. Can you share, can you discuss that a little?
Of course, yeah. I think you're right. So in terms of, even as one might emphasize that one book was more outward looking and inclusive of multitudes, the other more pensive and interior. The fact is that for me, poetry works best when it works at multiple levels, when it embraces public urgencies and a quiet, intimate interiority, when it's working with large, speculative, abstract questions, but also absolutely visceral matters of feeling and experience, when it's looking at the everyday and also considering deep historic and geological time. I think that is what poetry is the stage for, in fact, the bringing together of these opposite scales and scopes and visions. That said, I agree with you that the form of my poems has been shifting and changing. In some sense, it's gone back to some experiments in my very first book, Zones of Assault, which was now literally 30 years ago. Then followed a long period where I was more, if you will, classical in how I constructed my poems. Now, increasingly, it seems to me that the poem is a voice among voices. It presents what it has to say. The mise en page, as you see it, also has to do with the fact that it's a constellation of phrases and silences, of echoes. And it's also a way of inviting readers into the body of the poem, if you will. And it goes out in the way in which you might leave a gift with the reader. So for me, that's the spirit of how these poems conclude. Sometimes they do conclude with a conclusion, but it's not that idea of bringing it around to a triumphal conclusion. I don't think triumphal conclusions are possible very much these days.
No.
Much more open-ended. I wouldn't say tentative, but with the expectation that there might be a response, not self-contained in that sense.
Right. That's very, that's a that's something to ponder for any practitioner of poetry, which is, this waiting for a response, this keeping the door of the poem open at the end.
That's a lovely way
Uh,
of putting it. Yeah.
and many of the poems, also many of the poems, they kind of, one can say, they meld together an image of the world with a world out there, with images seen only with the mind's eye. For instance, in this poem of yours called Glove, which, which kinds of brings together on the writing table the image of this windswept glove with an inner image. Can you discuss that poem, and maybe, if you'd like,
Sure.
read from it? Read
No,
it.
I'm happy to read it. Let me read it, and then I'll
Right.
respond to your questions.
Right.
Yeah. Glove. Not a light-headed dove, not a plastic bag, that hand floating in the air, rising on a gust, gliding to the tarmac, is a glove a baggage handler slipped off with her name tag and form. Returning these goods, weapons can't slash her, fire can't scorch her. To sky and earth, keep them, she says. I look around for someone else to be. And that comes from something that actually happened. I actually saw this. It was, as I remember, an early morning. I was at the airport, that now unfamiliar site. I was there on an airport coach heading to a flight, and literally saw this. It just seized my attention, this glove that was floating. And by a series of associations, which is what we all thrive on as poets, it just set me thinking of how this really is reminiscent of those two lines in the center of the poem. They're actually a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Weapons can't slash her, fire can't scorch her. It comes from chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, and is a description of the soul as it survives. And this is the thought I took away from this floating glove that I saw. And so you have this poem as brief reflection, as fable, and also a play of scales.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. From the commonplace throwaway glove to
Yeah,
deep matters of the soul.
yeah.
Um, and another thing, and then it just builds from there. The construction of the book really takes off from there onto the larger themes that appear and reappear in various places throughout the book, which is, of course, um, the ecological crisis. And we'll come back to this, the
Sure.
ecological crisis that we're living through, which is a recurring theme in many of the poems. Would you say that these considerations framed the book as it appears now?
I think that's true, because I've been thinking about and writing or lecturing about a number of these issues in other parts of my work. And they come from a deep existential concern, of course, with our place in the world. And I think that that's become ever more precarious. And in these 2 years, what looks like a second year of quarantine, it's really been brought home to us that there are consequences for our insatiable greed and our meddling in the planet's mechanisms. So that was very strongly with me. For a number of years now, for instance, I've been preoccupied with questions of equity for animals as shareholders, fellow tenants of the earth. So the starting point, one of the starting points for this book would be my preoccupation with how infrastructure projects, for instance, are cutting across elephant corridors or leopard and tiger corridors, how we are penning animals into reservations, effectively. Call them national parks or call them what you will. And we in Bombay have this extremely strange scenario a vast metropolis with a national park right in the middle of it. And what is constantly characterized as interspecies conflict, it really has to do with the way we are encroaching on the natural world.
Absolutely.
So questions of that kind were definitely with me, leading to a tragic awareness of extinctions and endings, which is very much part of the book.
Absolutely. And it appears, this engagement with the themes of extinction and endings appears in multiple ways in the book, in the craft, in the imagery, in what you say in a slant way in many of the poems, which is what my next question will be, which is and also an invitation to read a poem, which is that your response is yours, which is, this exhilarating expansion of collocations and unexpected juxtapositions of ideas, which kind of invite in a very ludic way the reader to suspend their conceptions of, square pegs and square holes in which to fit them. In Hoskotian dimensions,
I love that adjective.
men can be Saturday.
Oh, indeed they can. Why not? That actually comes from a childhood memory. These are the trades and occupations and the people without occupations who vanished. I was just this morning in a conversation with a friend and colleague in architecture, where we were talking about how traditional architecture always made place for uh, occasions and for people who didn't have any immediate function. Whilst today, architecture and town planning is preoccupied with resources that can be monetized and people who have a clear purpose, otherwise you don't belong. But for many years, I think certainly uh, as a child, a teenager growing up in Bombay, I remember that there were people of no fixed function. It's as if two diagrams overlapped. The diagram of a sacred and a worldly sense of being, which wasn't modern and metropolitan, and yet participated fully in the fabric of the city. And there were people who wandered about, people like the Vasudevas. There was a person who came to the door every Saturday, and he was the man who was Saturday. So I'm going to read this and then I'll tell you more about him. Saturday. The man who is Saturday arrives smeared in vermilion, his one good eye bloodshot, his other eye in geostationary orbit. He plays two roles, the man who is Saturday. He's the comet rushing down the street, skirting the edge of luck. He's the dancer on the island, misdirecting the traffic. With a genial wave and a pointing finger, he ends the week with a kind of thunderclap you'd think was the monopoly of the rider on the grey horse, waving his sword of fire, wagging his fan of peacock feathers, exploding nucleus of this honkahedron day, the man who is Saturday.
Beautiful and charming.
Thank you. But this was this strange figure who would come up and proclaim himself as Shaniwari. That's who he was. He asked for alms with a certain sense of genial traditional entitlement. And then one day I saw him on a weekday in Mufti, very regular. So that was startling to me, but also a very early education in terms of liminality, how people can play multiple roles and exist in multiple universes, as the protagonist of this poem does. I mean, he might even be Kalki towards the end of the poem, an agent of high-spirited chaos in a city otherwise blundering through in its own sense of efficiency.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
I've actually always been attracted to these eccentric figures in the city, of whom you see less and less now.
absolutely so, absolutely so. Barring a few pockets in the city, and even vanishingly less and less in those pockets of the city.
Yes. You're a practitioner of street photography, so you must surely encounter some of these people as you travel through the city.
Not as often as I would imagine. Uh, and it's you're absolutely right. These kind of slipstream figures are now less and less to be seen
Yes.
in the fabric of the street. And that's what it is. It's and the changes that the city is undergoing architecturally, culturally, they're all part of the reason, I would imagine. But it's these little poems that make the book very personal, very cozy and intimate. Not cozy, but intimate in that sense. And at roughly the midpoint of the book is again a poem that startled me because it was such a departure from from your usual, I wouldn't say usual, but from your various registers, which is of course the poem that gives the collection its name, where the narrator speaks of being mocked for possibly his writing style by a literary rival. And
Right.
you care to tell us or not about that poem, and
Why
possibly
not?
read it?
I'm trying to remember actually how it came about. Um, I have a sense that I actually do know how it came about. And I've said this before, but it is, the story has many versions. One version is that I really was thinking about how poets tend to be simultaneously glorified as, the great voice of civilization. But you're also told, you know, you guys need to sit quietly in your corner. Your books don't sell very much. And where are your listeners anyway? And you don't have an impact as nonfiction writers do and as fiction does.
Absolutely. And then
This
those
is
people
right.
fall in love and they reach for a love song. Or,
Yes.
or, or they go to a funeral and then there is chanting.
And then there is chanting, exactly. So song or verse or poetry of some kind is everywhere. And I hold with Mallarmé, for instance, who said that there actually is no such thing as prose. There's just poetry that is set to different kinds of tempo. So Hunchprose emerged at one level uh, to dramatize the situation. How does the derided poet strike back through a sort of dramatic monologue? I love the form of the dramatic monologue. And so this is a bit of a setup, but towards the end of the poem, Hunchprose decides that he needs to be called something else. So
Hmm.
let me read this and then I'll take up the story again. Hunchprose. He calls me Hunchprose, but what's a word between murderous rivals? Across from me, he strops his fine blade, smooth talker, barefaced liar, bisfart, teller of tall tales, who wraps you up in his flying carpet, serves you snake oil, carries off the princess every time. And I, what can I offer you except fraying knots, coiled riddles, scrolled bones, keys to doors that were carted away by raiders, betrayed by splayed light and early snow, lost doors I could have opened with my breath. Call me Hunch Praise. I bend over my ink drift words, and when I spring back up, I sting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are the better for it. Um,
So it's playful. I mean, it's
yeah,
there's no serious sense that practitioners of other genres are deadly rivals, but it just helps
yeah,
polemically to remind ourselves of powers that poetry needs to recover, and the role that it could reclaim, as a matter of fact, at a time like this when we're overwhelmed by data, by fake news, and by other forms of mass inattention.
absolutely. And also perhaps by a very rigid idea of what a truth is.
I agree.
Of
I think also that poetry is the ground where you can test out truths. You can hold diverse viewpoints. Keats spoke of negative capability, for instance, and I think increasingly that it is the poetic I'm going to say the poetic rather than poetry that we need to have as a key element of education, because far too many disciplines are trying to move you towards certainty.
hmm,
There's still a positivist belief in some disciplines that certainty is possible, or towards quick, instrumental, pragmatic strategies. That you do need to be able to think through alternatives, to sometimes realize that closure is impossible. that one might go on a detour. There's no straight way to reach a resolution. And I think that poetry is truly an education in this more human way of thinking about the problems that beset us.
Absolutely, that's very well said. And at one point earlier on, you said that you were also concerned about, uh, and as one of your poems shows, which is about the non-human neighbors that we share the city with. Uh, like, of course, your poem, "The Book of Common Birds,"
Yes.
which which is again a poem that embraces this the totality of all the people in the city, human and non-human. Would you like to read it out?
Sure, I will. You know, a long, long time ago, Peter Singer, the philosopher Peter Singer's book "Animal Liberation" was a major point of inspiration for me. This is when I was originally thinking about questions of the tenancy of the planet, and I did political science as my first degree. So even as we were thinking of questions of equity and justice, it was entirely a human-oriented discourse. And there was no question that we needed to regard any of the other animal species as having any kinds of rights at all. And we're paying the price for that today. So here comes the Book of Common Birds. Look after these birds. To the goose, skirting the edge of the creek, leave your hands. The gull, gliding to a perch in the mangroves, can have your feet. The vulture, skulking above the towers of silence, could use your ears. The owl, spy master of the people, gets your eyes. Your hopes could shimmer through the rainbow-throated pigeon, its head cocked for runaway trains, for the Siberian crane, winter refugee. Spare your memories of rain, sketched across lighthouse and bay. But your voice, let it ransom the peacock held captive in the zoo, spelling yourself in a tongue of fire. You'd be so much grain cracking in the beak of a bird, molting out of itself, a thing of air and water again.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And I read in this poem, uh, personally speaking, about reclaiming this kindred oneness, this ability to commune on equal grounds with these non-human people.
Yes, yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it, non-human people, because we do need to recognize them as strange word, stakeholders in some sense. And it's cast as a kind of last will and testament.
Hmm.
So it's
Yes,
also in that sense
absolutely.
looking to a time that may well be post-human.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
And just as you were speaking, it also occurred to me how we actually uh, distort our own language. We here are now speaking correctly about reclaiming powers, energies, and possibilities. But particularly in the discourse of a coastal city like Bombay,
Hmm.
observe how we've misused this term reclamation, which actually is
Yes.
a nonsense word. Because what we're saying, what do we say? We say that we are reclaiming land from the sea, as though the sea took it away in the first place. But the point is, we have absolutely no right to that land. We
Right.
never owned it. It was always underwater. It
Yeah.
belongs to the sea.
Yes.
So what we are actually doing is to encroach on the sea, but we don't refer to that as encroachment. We regard ourselves as having a sovereign right to any land, any potential land that the sea might thoughtlessly and unwisely be washing over. So we want to reclaim that. But it's a little word, but for instance, it undergirds what we are doing today in terms of the coastal road.
Absolutely.
Again, it's the notion that this useless stretch of water really is something we can be using for
Yeah.
car, essentially, not even public transport very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then of course, as the book progresses beyond the midpoint, it develops and builds on this theme specifically through, for instance, the metaphor of the lion, the last lion alive, which is very poignant, that attacks and kills its tamer. And it is again it was very tempting for me to link this metaphor with the climate crisis, with the degradation of the earth. What do you think?
Oh, I agree. I think there's the line recurs in a number of these poems. Sometimes as the man masquerading as a lion, and then his
Yeah,
entire sense of
yeah,
mastery gets taken away when his lion mask vanishes, suddenly
absolutely.
exposed as vulnerable as anybody, possibly more. Then there are the two companion pieces that have to do with the lion tamer and the lion going on a transcontinental ride, and you hear from each of them.
Yes, yes, yes. Would
So
you care
very
to read
much,
this?
yeah, I'd love to actually. It's a diptych, so I'm going to read.
Yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the lion tamer's nightmare. I am the only creature at bay in this cage hurtling towards Siberia. Up against the bars, my whip thrown away, alone against my lion. He fixes me with a roar you could hear in your dreams halfway across the continent. I fend off his massive paws with tattered arms. When he goes for my throat, his stinking fangs shred what's left of my masterful breath. His mane shrouds me in a final, imperial, practically useless gold.
Wow.
And from the point of view of the other occupant of this carriage, Endling, my keepers console me. I'm the last, most famous member of my tribe. Celebrity breeds flickering avatars, not seed. I'll soon be a phantom of the archive. There's no one to match my pug mark, or will ever be. This fire-braided drive will sputter out as I rocket across the steppe, locked in a cage, its bars striped on rolling snow. In its far corner cowers my tamer, a bag of skin peeling off a spine, mangled by his worst nightmare come to life.
Wow.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And it's I found it particularly effective to have the diptych of, of both points of view, which again continues this sort of conversation about who is a person really.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
um, uh, and of course, there are some, most of the poems are very slant, they talk about this issue in a slant way, but some uh, to a greater extent than others, talk explicitly about environmental pollution and climate change. Poems like Sovereign, which I had the good fortune to read before inclusion in this
Right.
volume. I think Plume Poetry carried it, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
right. Yeah. Sovereign, was it in Plume or was it in, I think it was on Guftagu, actually.
Guftagu, probably Guftagu. Sorry, my mistake.
So Sovereign came about from a fascination with this incredible journey that an Arctic fox made. You remember this,
Yeah.
right? Literally across the ocean, from Norway to Canada. And just the idea of these unbelievable journeys being made by animals pursuing traditional routes in that sense. Uh, was layered for me over everything else that we are doing to the ocean. And I kept thinking it's the same thing, the elephant corridors, the leopard and the tiger corridors, the routes that are being taken by Arctic foxes. They are following millennial instincts and intuitions which connect them territorially, across territories. And our interference is simply producing obstacles and ruining the lives of species who do not have redress. So this is a question that to me was deeply visceral. It wasn't an abstract question of justice alone. It was also just, I also remember very, very vividly from the early 90s. I can't remember where the oil slick was, but it's an image that has stuck in my mind. The image of seabirds utterly drenched in crude oil and just flapping helplessly about. And, just the idea that a species can be wiped out by a sucker punch that comes from some unexpected, much, much larger framework. Reminds me also of Gregory Bateson's remark. Gregory Bateson was a cybernetics pioneer and an anthropologist. He says that a species that gets smarter than its environment is doomed.
Right, absolutely.
And it begins to tinker about and destroy its own habitat, which is
Absolutely.
what we're doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you care to read this?
Sure, I will, because it's, earlier we did say that Jonah Whale tends to be more public in some sense, but you'll see that poems like Sovereign also have that sort of anthemic quality, if you will.
Absolutely.
So, Sovereign. Plucking sunsets from the water, the horned sovereign half stamps, half slides across the beach, stopping to dig, claw, rake. What washes up is drilled shale, lost static, parsed from gulf to strait. Plastic worlds in whose wake gagged dolphins trail, scarred humpback whales whose shadows will drift unmoored up thawing glaciers. What washes up is news of the cracked ice, across which a shivering fox is making her way from Svalbard to Nunavut, leaving her paw prints on frozen currents to a shore stippled with burst nebulae, a shore that on a compass dizzy with wind-scattered directions, she can and can't call home.
Magnificent.
Thank you.
It's an epic image. The protagonist is an Arctic fox, and it's an epic terrain, an epic image detailing, and of course you mention Svalbard, which of course
Is the seed vault.
yes,
Yeah.
is the arc in which
Yes.
in case so let me quickly add a footnote, which is that Svalbard in Norway is the site of an underground vault in which seed samples of various, mainly agricultural, but also other trees and plants have been kept, so that there is a reference, in case it is needed, in the hope that it is never needed, but in case it is needed, it can be used to reseed
The earth.
whatever land that is required. And
Remains, exactly.
and I read recently in recent months, or perhaps a year back, that Svalbard is also going through
The temperature is rising.
in
That's
Svalbard as well.
Yeah.
So it's not a snow
No,
carapace as it used to be.
it used to be a natural ice box, and
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
less of that now. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, of course, speaking of references, you provide, there is a section, I don't think it's there in Jonah Whale.
It is. Jonah Whale has notes too.
Has notes to, right?
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
in keeping with
right.
that, in keeping, continuing that, you provide a section with brief notes about some of the concepts some of the words you use, some of the concepts that you've mentioned in the poems. Can you tell us if you intend this sort of back and forth to take place in the act of reading, or you want us to go through them at the end? What is the...
Okay. As always, it begins in delight. In Jonah Whale, I actually began to write out some of the notes, at least partly because Jonah Whale for me was a book in which many of the internal partitions that I had kept up for many years, they came down. So one of these was, for instance, the partition that separated the Anglophone poet in me from the listener of Hindustani classical music. So there are poems in which Bandish lines take over, and there's the multiplicity of languages. Another line, another partition that broke down, which I tried to keep up for a very long time, was between the poet and the scholar. So in my scholarly role as a theorist, or as someone who writes art history, uh, the footnote is a very important device, the end note. Now, when I was doing the selected poems of the Dom Murray's selected poems for Penguin Modern Classics, that's when I decided I would write a note to every single poem in that book. And that for me became a form unto itself. I really enjoy writing endnotes in that particular way because it allows you to be wry, playful, idiosyncratic. I'm a great connoisseur of the eccentric footnote. Richard Burton, for instance, is a writer of completely eccentric, verging on mad footnotes. So to me, it's the opposite of the boring, dry academic piece of necessary or unnecessary information. So I like to practice it as a form in itself. So once that got going in Jonah Whale, I thought, here too, uh, I need to point out a few things. And to me, it's like what people used to call a bonus track, if that's still a term. It's a bonus track. You can read it if you want to. And it stands beside the poem. I mean, I would never want the end note or the footnote to replace the reading of the poem. But it does offer you a context sometimes, or opens up another train of thought. As a reader, I enjoy detours and meandering. So this could be treated precisely as that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and it's very helpful. I mean, it
Good to
definitely
know.
it it definitely adds to the it adds layers to the subsequent rereadings of the poem.
I'm very glad to hear that, actually.
So, for instance, and I would like to, as an example of what I mean by subsequent rereadings or relayerings, which is there is this poem. I don't know how to pronounce the name, Lemuria.
Lemuria, yes.
Lemuria. So which is of course Lemuria is an occult, is a concept very much adopted by the occult, and the poem is of course also inscribed to the artist Susan Hiller, who I understand was fascinated by the paranormal and did not really like these distinctive categories of normal, paranormal, etc. Um, can you tell can you tell me a little bit about that poem and
Sure. Um, Lemuria as a place or an imagined place or a once upon a time place comes to me from that part of my family history which is tied up with theosophy, the Theosophical Society. Um, it's one of the continents in theosophical lore. It's a far more complex. I'm summarizing brutally, but every root race, as the theosophists put it, has a continent of its own, which then might survive or mutate, or in the case of Lemuria, it apparently sank. So in a lot of late 19th, early 20th century worldviews, Lemuria does play a role. So whether it's for the Theosophists or even for a particular strand within Dravidianist anti-Aryan politics, Lemuria is seen as the lost homeland, which was Dravidian civilization. So one way or the other, in this poem, it comes to me to mean a time and a place of lost origins. Also because it's set in the global south. It's south of here. It's apparently in the Indian Ocean, south of Sri Lanka. It came to signify for me a stage where one could think about the exactions and the costs of colonial empire, what that had done to people's ways of being, to their languages, to their economies, to their ecologies. So the poem is really an extended lament for those who were expropriated, in some cases even exterminated, destroyed through the genocidal processes of colonialism and empire. And Susan Hiller, who passed away 2 years ago, is one of my favorite artists. She had a very strong base in anthropology and philosophy. She was certainly concerned with the spectrum of what is regarded as normal and what the spectral end of that might be. But also one of her very greatest works was this installation, a film installation called The Last Silent Movie. It's a loop with a great many recordings of endangered or extinct languages. And each time, that's all you hear. And you sit down, as in a movie theater, that's how the installation is constructed. And there's a black screen with only the subtitles telling you what's playing. And you hear it's, you don't see anything, because what she's suggesting is that there's nothing anymore to see. You only hear literally the last words of the last speaker of a certain language. So Welsh, Romani, the languages of the certain Pacific Islands, many, many, many languages which no longer exist except in recordings. So for a number of years, I wanted to write this poem for her. And well, it comes late. She's gone. But there's the poem, which others could hopefully read. So that was the backstory to this.
Wonderful, and which sets us up nicely to request you to read. It's a long, long poem. We have 15 minutes left. So do you
Let me read a section. I'll read the first section.
Yes, yes.
Yeah? Okay. Lemuria, in memoriam Susan Hiller. Be my guest. You were slow. You came late to the game. Spears and shells were no use against artillery shells. All you had were brittle, broken bones, once cushioned by flesh, now flutes. Your folded tissues of air, dried bark, silk water, taken away, locked in vault or vitrine. Your echoes hung behind glass. And the world big cocoon of your hearing, trapped in the scratchy, whining plate that the explorer's needle jabs to start. Tell him you want it back. Your voice, every one of your voices, you know that sound has no frame.
Wow,
That's section one.
fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
So we seem to have a few questions from the audience, which is Vinita. I don't know if you can see this panel that I've put on the screen. Vinita says, thank you for the rightful kind words for animals that have emerged from your wonderful discussion. My question is related to the title of the collection. She asked, how did the title Hunchprose come about?
As I was saying to someone else the other day, I'm going to, from now on, adopt Aga Shahid Ali's preferred explanation for things. And I'm going to say, it came to me in a dream. Shahid was absolutely marvelous, great, inspiring figure. But no, I think not so much in a dream as it just came out of thinking about this marginalized figure as I was imagining him or her to be in the poem. Deformed, possibly, pushed to one side, and eerily, to my mind, reminiscent of Quasimodo, one of my favorite characters in fiction, from Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yes.
So how is it that this ill-favored figure nonetheless produces this absolutely soul-stirring, enchanting music of the bells, the carillon from the cathedral?
Yes.
So what is poetry? Perhaps it's Hunchprose, an ill-favored steps prose. But could be hunch praise, as I go on to say in the poem.
Absolutely. When you spring back, you...
Yes, sting.
Yeah, sting. And we have a question from Richa,
Right.
which is, she says, thank you for this lively discussion and the evocative readings of the magnificent poems. Ranjit, from what you say about reclamation and sovereignty and even about language, I would love to hear your thoughts on the idea of home as well as of belonging, as that's where most struggles seem to be rooted.
That's a beautiful question. Both of these are questions that really open us up to think about questions of articulation, of where your citizenship might be, but where also through affect you might belong. And I think it is one of the key urgencies of our times. At a point when people who have sought refuge in this country are being pushed out to face certain genocide in the country that we want to push them back to where they apparently belong. There are any number of diasporic populations already in this country, from elsewhere in the world, from within South Asia. And it really invites us to think about the grounds by which we belong, and to think about a far more textured and layered form of belonging. I think many of our crises emerge from unitary and narrow notions of where we belong. I think the more we recognize that it is circulation rather than rootedness that defines us, uh, the more capacious we will be in understanding our sense of where home might be and how we might actually craft a sense of home. I don't know that the notion of home is ready-made. Usually, if it's ready-made, you'll find that there's some kind of myth attending that rooted belonging, and you will find that below the roots will be people whose claims were disregarded and who might have been dishoused. So these are some of the thoughts that I have when I think about these questions of home and belonging. Uh, but also it's my usual claim in these matters is that the further back we look, the more multiple our allegiances will turn out to be. And it's important to reclaim them from the official definitions of the modern nation state, which wants to narrow and particularize and peg people down. So yeah, I would always think in terms of a more nomadic, capacious, plural identity. Because it's through that awareness of one's own plurality that one begins to seek common ground. Otherwise, we're all going to be entrenched in our supposed primordial and immutable difference. In that case, where's the room for dialogue or collaboration or conversation or
Absolutely.
making anything together?
Absolutely, absolutely, and very well said. Would you like to read out, to let's bring this session to a close to a gentle close with few
Okay.
poems.
Okay. Why don't I close, not in a gentle way, but maybe I'll read the last poem in the book.
But one second, one second.
Ah, okay.
Sarabjit has a question,
Oh,
which is he says, "Thank you for this wonderful session. The poem Train is a small one,
aha.
yet it charts a wide arc. Can you brief us about the
Yes.
background to the poem?"
Train. Yes, there we are. Shall I? Maybe then I'll read the poem. Do
Sure.
we have time for that? Do we have time?
Of course, of course. We have about 10 minutes.
Fabulous. Okay. Thank you, Sarabjit, for that question. Here comes Train. What was I thinking? The train whistle woke the whole town up. Good souls zipped fast into their spacesuits, discovered no moon and lush flames swirling under barrels of tar, lined up outside rows of houses steeped centuries deep in peace, a soul sleep elsewhere familiar, only to livestock curtained from the falling axe, and the sealed train that's about to bump west-east across cratered plains, carrying its death weight.
Wow.
Thank you. So train came to me out of a series of lines of feeling and thinking. Um, there are traumas that we inherit, which don't necessarily belong only to our own nation state or our own part of the world. Uh, I've been possessed, for instance, by what I take to be some kind of collective memory of the Holocaust. And although one might say that we here were in no way responsible for it, it is part of the sinister and dark side of the human heritage because Holocausts can and have been replicated. So it's easy to blame the Nazis, and they were indeed blameworthy. But there are Nazis immanent in many, many of us. Imminent, and articulated as well, as we see from our own experience here. So the presence of the, the transports to the concentration camps and the death camps, that was in mind. The trains that ran across the new border drawn by Radcliffe after partition, and its horrendous cargo, if you will, of bodies going each way. These are traumas and horrors that we have to accept and acknowledge and be repentant about. And these are the traumas that ask us to rededicate ourselves to memory, because far too many people believed that they had been centuries deep in peace. As I say, the soul sleep that I talk about in this poem is the belief that nothing was really wrong. We didn't know what was going on. Who knew what these trains were bringing or what they were taking away? We had no idea. The orders came from elsewhere, nothing to do with us. We've heard these excuses again and again and again across societies. Could have been Nazi Germany, could have been Rwanda, could be here. So this is a lesson that we have to learn and relearn, because it's a lesson that we forget very easily. So that was the deep background to this poem. And some of the linguistic choices in it, these words, death weight, for instance, are a tribute to one of my favorite poets, Paul Celan, who was very much the product of the Holocaust. He lost his parents to the Holocaust, and ever after wrote in a German that was also the German that was spoken by his parents' killers. But he reclaimed that language. He made it his own. He reinvented it. So there are many lessons in courage from that phalanx of writers, which includes Paul Celan, for instance, or Ingeborg Bachmann. So yes, these are some of the subtexts around or below train.
Sarabjit thanks you. It says beautifully articulated. Sylph wants to ask and also has a request. It has been a treat, no less. Please, could you also read Prayer and shed some light if time permits, which I think is a beautiful ending.
Lovely.
A poem called Prayer.
Okay, I'll be happy to read that, of course. Okay. Prayer. Don't ask for the wall of the skin to break, the light blue line of morning to be drawn across your eyelids, the first watchful parrot of the day to ambush you with prayers. Peel back every proverb you were taught to reveal the raw wealth of ardor until you find where the reluctant chronicler wrote, burn and dance because what is healed is dead.
Wow.
Thank you.
And with that, it provides the perfect opportunity to say thank you, Ranjit Hoskote, for joining us at this PEN at Prithvi session. And thank you to everybody who not only listened, but also contributed with really, really good questions. Thank you so much, Ranjit. And it's been a real pleasure to speak with you about Hunchprose. I might remind the audience, although I suspect many of them have the book already, but for those who don't, that Hunchprose is available online and offline. Very much widely available in India. Get your copy if you haven't already. It's published by Penguin, Hamish Hamilton, 2021. This is PEN at Prithvi. We are a fortnightly online program talking to writers from India and beyond, writing in various languages. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ranjit.
Suhit, thank you very much. It's really been a delight to be in conversation with you. Thank you for your questions and your responses. And I too would like to thank everyone who came to this session today. Thank you all for being here and for your questions and your responses.
That's right.
And have a lovely evening.
Have a lovely evening, everybody. And Ranjit, bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye.